Hi, I'm Aaron A. Reed, and I'm in the middle of a year-long project about the history of games made with words. This December marks the 50th anniversary of the original text-only Oregon Trail game, and since there are about 50 weeks in a year, that gave me the idea to spend each one of them blogging about a single text game from 1971 to today, one game for each year. Now, when you hear text game, you might think of text adventures, but there have been all kinds of microgenres over the years that have used words instead of graphics to tell their stories. Of course, at first games were forced to rely on text because the earliest computers had very limited graphical capabilities. But rather than dying out when graphics took over, text games have wriggled and evolved their way into all kinds of corners of the gaming landscape. And without the spotlight of the mainstream, so many of these games have been free to experiment and innovate. Each of the games this series is looking at is a unique snapshot of the time and place it was made, a nexus of technical and cultural and economic and personal decisions. Many of these games are in danger of being lost or have been overlooked by newer generations of gamers, and I've been thrilled to make the case why each one is worth remembering. Now, choosing which games to cover has also been an interesting challenge. The conceit of covering just a single game from each year has meant I've had to skip over many classics, but it's also made me look more closely at understudied time periods and led me to discover a lot of hidden gems. The series hit 1989 just this week, so there's a lot more to come, but no shortage of fascinating stories to tell. In a 10-minute talk, I can't begin to do justice, so I'm just going to take you on a whirlwind tour picking one game from each decade that's maybe a little more on the obscure side to give you a taste of all the great stories in this weird little thread of gaming history. So let's start with the 70s, and the first company to succeed at selling games for personal computers, Adventure International. Not everyone's heard of them today, but for a few years they were the kings of computer gaming, racking up millions in sales, and they paved the way for the software giants of the 80s. The founders of both Sierra and Broderbund got their start working there. They even invented the first retail packaging for computer games, and yeah, they came on cassette tapes back then. Now, if you have heard of this company, you may think you know who wrote all their games. After all, it was his name on all the boxes. But if we look at the title screens for some of these games, we see another name, Scott's wife at the time, Alexis. So who was Alexis Adams? She was an entrepreneur who actually ran most of the business side of the company and also collaborated with Scott on some of the games, even teaching herself enough coding to write at least one of them herself. Scott credited much of the unique feel of Pirate Adventure, their second game, to her. It's one of the earliest text adventures where the player's main goal is building something, not collecting treasure or killing monsters. You're shipwrecked and you need to repair your boat. There's a pirate, but instead of trying to kill you or rob you like NPCs in earlier games, he basically just wants to get drunk and not have to do any work. At one point, you find him sleeping off a bender in a graveyard. Alexis had sole author credit on the 1979 game Voodoo Castle, again though only on the title screen. And this game, which is dedicated to all moms, has a character named after the Adams' daughter, Megan. This character is one of the first women in a computer game with dialogue. Scott and Alexis later divorced, and her part in the legacy of the company faded over time, but she was undoubtedly a huge part of the world's first successful computer game studio. Then there was the 1980s, the decade of Infocom's legendary interactive fiction. But let's fast forward through all that and talk instead about an even more obscure genre, play-by-mail gaming. In Monster Island, you play a castaway survivor on a dangerous continent. The game ran on a computer, but the players never touched one. Instead, they'd fill out a paper order form each week detailing their character's next moves and send it into the company through the mail, no software required. Once a week, you'd get back a turn report, a stack of laser-printed pages detailing the results of your orders. In Monster Island, thousands of players shared the same persistent virtual world, an enormous continent 3 times the size of Australia with over 250,000 individual locations. The game started out simple. The rulebook was just a tiny pamphlet that listed less than 20 orders. But as you kept exploring, the list of actions you knew how to do would grow. Reach a trading outpost and you'd learn orders for buying and selling goods. Stumble across another player and you'd learn orders for how to be friendly or hostile. You might even learn how to request and send in entirely different kinds of order cards. Years before wikis, players had to coordinate through letters and fanzines to figure out how the game they were playing even worked. And it was so huge that years after it launched, major portions of it, like an elaborate magic system, still remained largely mysterious. Play-by-mail gaming mostly died out in lockstep with the rise of email and the web, but a hardcore Monster Island fanbase continued playing the game for almost 30 years, an incredible run for a game its creator had hoped would last for 3. In the early 90s, a rather unusual game was released called Silverwolf. This obscure text adventure is about a group of shape-shifting women superheroes protecting an ordinary schoolgirl they believe is the reincarnation of a god. It was made by, and you're not going to believe this, a group of shape-shifting women really into schoolgirls and strange divinities. But let's back up. In the early 80s, St. Bride's School opened up on the remote Irish coast. It was a sort of fantasy camp where women could take on the roles of Victorian-era schoolgirls under the tutelage of a strict headmistress. There was no electricity, and modern materials like plastic were forbidden. But sort of inexplicably, in 1985, this group that shunned the modern world started making and selling computer games. Maybe as a publicity stunt to draw attention to the school, or maybe the school was a publicity stunt to draw attention to the games. It's unclear. In fact, many things about St. Bride's are unclear to this day because the women behind it deployed a baffling array of different names and personas. There may have been as many as 14 or as few as 2 distinct women behind them. And what they were really up to in that house in Ireland remains a puzzle. Some of them had once been involved with a group called Lux Madriana that worshipped a female god. Some of them were really into discipline. Whatever their true beliefs, Silverwolf was one of St. Bride's last games released, and it's filled with beautiful writing and enigmatic riddles. I especially love this description of a tree made of ice filled with the buzzing of silver bees. There's some suggestion its author may have been trans. If so, this makes Silverwolf one of the earliest queer games. The full story of St. Bride's is a wild rabbit hole. I haven't even mentioned the Atlantis cult, the Forbidden Door, or the connection to the 70s King Kong film, but I love how it gives the lie to the notion that the only people writing text games in the 20th century were bland hacker dudes. And now we've reached the 2000s, and this next one doesn't have any pictures because it was a game by and for the blind.
Proximity biodisruptor mine in 18 feet. East door in 9 feet. Manual bolt gun. Long knife. White data wafer taken.
Whoa.
West 30 by 50 feet. There is an exit from the room behind and to the left.
Shades of Doom is an audio-only first-person shooter. In a time before accessibility modes were common, blind or disabled gamers who wanted an action game had to build it themselves. Shades paints an audio soundscape with 3D positioned sound, which are loaded with useful information to help players navigate a maze of levels. Approach an intersection, for instance, and you can hear the sound of wind blowing down the side corridor. Your constant companion is Ava, the envirometric vector analyzer, a sort of screen reader for reality, who at the stroke of a key can describe the dimensions of rooms, the distance to walls or objects, and turn on a tracking device that helps pinpoint the location of moving monsters. Eva supports nearly 40 single-key commands, using almost every key on the keyboard, and learning to quickly deploy them is key to staying alive in a maze filled with zombies, mutant dogs, cyborgs, and traps like pits and jets of gas. Surviving the 9 levels of gameplay is a huge challenge, but one that's equally hard for blind and sighted players alike. Shades delivers fast-paced, tension-filled gameplay with only spoken words and positional audio, more than living up to its famous namesake. And finally, the 2010s, and actually I'm going to cheat a bit and pick a game from the start of 2020. Sense and Semiosis is a lovely little text game about reminiscences triggered by bottles of perfume lovingly lingered over. As you read each description and the memories it triggers, you get to decide what they mean to you, what you want them to represent. It's a small game, it takes just a few minutes to play, but behind the scenes is an astonishing attention to detail in procedurally generating each delicate mood and description. Just before this game came out, AI Dungeon was getting a lot of attention for its promise of infinite stories from an artificial storyteller. Sense and Semiosis is precisely the opposite, a carefully sculpted and very human marriage of prose and systems to produce a handcrafted, joyful experience. It's also part of an unbroken thread of text game history, written at the end of the 2010s in an interactive story design language made in the 2000s, that evolved from a 90s language reverse engineering Infocom story format from the 80s, which originated in turn in the 70s with Zork. Some of Zork's technical DNA still lives in Sense and Semiosis today, and that's pretty cool. It's up for a Nebula Award for game writing this year alongside much more well-known titles, but I think it's beautiful that this delicate, handcrafted sculpture made from words and code is on that stage. So in the past half-century, text games have been everything from the mainstream to the underground and all kinds of weirdnesses in between. They've been made by all kinds of people with all kinds of things to say, explored countless ways that text can be fluid and stories reactive, and been a constant source of inspiration as small creators with unique visions have redefined what games made of words can do, mean, and be over and over again. If you want to follow along with the rest of the series, you can find it at if50.substack.com. Thank you for watching, and enjoy the rest of your Bang Bang Con.